Celia asked me to present on ethical issues related to qualitative data sharing. And we tried to do this last year and we got a little sidelined by the initial freak out about like, what do you mean I have to share my qualitative data? You can't do that. So I'm going to try to head that off and talk less about the regulations and more about the sort of the ethical and philosophical and sort of epistemological stuff that comes up when we talk about qualitative data sharing. Save some of the stipulations and the regulations for the end, and then that stuff you can all look up, and we can have a debate later about the merits of whether this should even be a thing. But I want to try to head that off now and talk more about kind of how the new NIH guidance applies and how we might think about complying with it. So you may or may not know, but you probably do, that there is a new data sharing policy from NIH that went into effect this year that requires a much more robust data sharing and management plan than many of us have ever been subject to. And the requirement applies to all scientific data, and this is the way they define scientific data: the recorded factual material of sufficient quality to validate and replicate your research findings. And so this applies to every piece of scientific data that our studies produce, the rows and columns of numbers that we produce from a survey, and the qualitative data. And this isn't like a surprise. There are some really compelling reasons that the field in general has been moving towards more open access and transparency and data sharing. Where am I trying to go with this? So, and some of it comes out of this crisis in reproducibility that emerged out of psychology several years ago. There was this moment where people realized that researchers were failing to replicate studies, and it created this sort of crisis of what does science even mean? And this kicked off this movement towards more transparency in science, including these data sharing mandates. And so what that sets up is an argument that the primary rationale for data sharing is about promoting rigor and reproducibility in our research. There are other arguments also for why we want to share data, encouraging public trust in federally funded research, encouraging and using novel analytic methods or meta-analyses to capitalize on existing data. So these are two RFAs that NIH has released that are specifically designed to encourage use of secondary data sets and using data in new ways and using novel methods to stimulate new advances in science. And people are also making arguments about like use of federal funds, right? That the public is paying for this research. We are paying a lot of money. Our studies are very expensive. Maybe we should be getting more for our dollars. And you see it come up not only in NIH's data sharing requirements and in their encouragement of the secondary research, but you also see it in the peer-reviewed literature side. So in 2014, which is 10 years almost before NIH's new policy, the PLOS journals instituted a policy that requires authors to make their data available, that is necessary to replicate their studies' findings. And the argument in their policy is that data sharing fosters scientific progress by allowing validation, replication, and reproducibility. And so this is all about transparency and replication. And the reason that I'm here talking about this and that somehow I have gotten myself involved in this is because I sort of picked a fight with PLOS One when they demanded my qualitative transcripts. I published
Who demanded?
PLOS One. So I published a qualitative piece in PLOS One, and they came back and said our policy requires that you make your qualitative transcripts available. And I said, why? And they said, so that other researchers can replicate your findings. And I said, first of all, and I wrote a treatise about how this is an inappropriate application of standards of scientific rigor to a discipline that doesn't embrace this idea of replication. And as you all know now, I am an instrument of my data collection and I am an instrument of my analysis. And what do you mean if I give some of my transcripts, they're going to be able to reproduce? They can't. If I give my transcripts to Roberto, he's going to do a different analysis and he's going to come up with a different product because that is the way this world works. So I write this long thing and I am ready to have a giant fight with them. And they just come back and say, okay, that's fine.
Join our board.
Board. right, I was like really ready to go to the mat about this. But it has gotten me thinking about eh, how and when these kinds of arguments for data sharing apply in our qualitative work and our mixed methods work, what the differences are between more quantitative approaches and more constructivist, qualitative, interpretivist social science pursuits, and how we need to think about these mandates for data sharing when it comes to qualitative research. So my knee-jerk reaction that first time was, no, I will not. But I have gotten a little bit more nuanced in my thinking and in talking with people about it. And so that's why I think we want to try to have some of that conversation here. And maybe the answer isn't absolutely not, but how and why and under what circumstances. And the knee-jerk reaction when we say no is typically around privacy and protecting the privacy of our respondents and their confidentiality. But I also think there are other bigger issues here than just privacy. There are ways to deal with protecting people's privacy, but there's other reasons to think more deeply about how and when and why we might or might not share our qualitative data. So I also want to kind of save the privacy, the very practical concerns about privacy for a little bit later in the conversation. And here is when I will invoke my UC Riverside colleagues. I started talking about this with Dina Plemons, who's an anthropologist who studies the doing of research. And she runs the Center for Research Ethics at UC Riverside. And she and a bunch of people are funded through an NSF initiative to think about these things. And they convene these workshops where they bring in a bunch of philosophers and science and technology study people and anthropologists and sociologists and me, who in that context is a very applied, very pragmatic person. And we started talking about why and when and how you might do that. And they have put together this online, as part of the Online Ethics Center, they have put together a community of practice of people who are thinking about these issues. And they're having conversations like this in that group. So if this is a thing you're interested in, I would point you towards this Online Ethics Center. They have a lot of cool resources. So we did this workshop where we brought all these people together, and Dina asked us to write a piece where we argued the opposite of our knee-jerk reaction. So if my default position is I will not share data because I do research about drug use and with criminalized people and I can't data identify it properly and I have to protect them, she asked me to write a piece arguing the other side of that issue and come to this workshop prepared to kind of talk through it. And to do that, you have to think about what the assumptions are for why we are sharing qualitative data. And what the assumptions and philosophies are that underlie how we produce the data that we're talking about. In quantitative approaches, we sort of, we think about our data in terms of rows and columns. We think that we can pluck those data out of the survey machine, out of their context, give it to somebody else who can analyze it. We give it to a statistician, they run some models, they give us the data back. Or I give my data set to somebody and they ask different questions of my data set, or they combine it with other data for different purposes to answer different questions. We have assumptions about the fact that that is possible, right? That I can do that I can take that data set, I can give it to somebody else and they can make sense out of it in exactly the same way I would, because it's not a context dependent piece of work. There's other assumptions that underlie our sort of quantitative or quantitative leaning sciences, right? We base our sampling and statistics on underlying probability distributions that we believe are real, right? We do things like representative sampling. We think that we are getting real and true representation of a community based on our underlying distributions. We use statistical analyses that allow us to estimate values with certain levels of precision. And the idea is that we're measuring some sort of true phenomenon, right? Some true association that lies within those data. And that association is also independent of the context. And I can calculate that odds ratio, or you can calculate that odds ratio, but it's the same odds ratio and it's true. And we try in our statistical approaches to control away. We not only assume that our data are context independent, but we control away that context through adjusting for confounding. Statistical techniques. So we assess this thing, we measure this odds ratio, we generate a data set, we analyze it outside of the context in the sterile room, and we generate this thing that is true and can be replicated. If I give it to you, you'll do it again. And as a social scientist and somebody who's trained in anthropology, I would argue with some of those assumptions. I don't think those, and maybe you can tell by my tone, I don't think even those assumptions are true, right? But it is the case that we imagine that our quantitative data are produced independently of the conditions of their creation and can be shared and can be used for other purposes. And that the researcher themselves has little to no influence on the actual creation of what's in that data set. And we assume that anybody else can analyze it. And the concern comes up that these assumptions really don't hold if you're engaged in qualitative work from a more constructivist or interpretivist or humanistic perspective. If you're doing qualitative work from this more constructivist philosophy, you can't just apply those assumptions wholesale to these kinds of data, and you can't apply the same sort of standards around rigor and reproducibility that you would in a quantitative paradigm. We sample differently, as we talked about this morning, right? We sample for specific purposes, rarely for the sake of generalizability, but often for the sake of diversity and representation. We design our sampling plan with context in mind. We spent a whole hour this morning talking about the relationships that we build to get the data that we hope to get out of qualitative interviews. And so we assume that the data can't be decontextualized from the broader life circumstances of the people who provided the data and the people who collected the data and the conditions under which they were created. So when I do an interview, I ask the questions, I ask follow-up questions, and in part, the data that are produced are part of the relationship that I'm building with that person. The data are co-created out of that relationship. And so some would argue, I think many people in the qualitative and social sciences would argue that you can't analyze those data without me. I produce the data, I am an instrument of their creation. And so I can't just give it to you and expect that you're gonna kind of pluck it out of where it was made in the same way that you could pluck a spreadsheet and come up with the same answers that I can. You'll be missing things because you're not me and I'm not there. And so this kind of relates to this concept of data completeness. In qualitative methods, we think about conceptual saturation, and we talk about how many interviews do we have to know that we've sufficiently explored a thing. And we think about our qualitative data set as complete or having achieved conceptual saturation when we know we've got the answers to the thing that we were asking about. And so by definition, that data set is complete for me, for my purposes, for my research questions, but it may not be complete for somebody else who wants to use my qualitative data to answer different questions. By design, I didn't ask all the questions that Roberto might have asked, or I asked follow-up questions in a different way than he might have. And so if he wants to use my data to understand how people are managing fentanyl adulteration in their methamphetamine in Nevada, and he wants to combine them with his data on managing fentanyl adulteration in Puerto Rico, they might be two partial incomplete data sets because we didn't create them the same way with a standardized instrument. And if something's missing, you don't know why it's missing. In a survey, we can understand our patterns of missing data. We can understand why something became missing. We can do statistical things to adjust for missingness, but you can't do that same thing in a qualitative data set. You don't know if a conversation about xylazine is missing in my data because I failed to ask or because we don't have xylazine yet. You can't tell the difference. And so when we think about like that creates a different set of data for sharing, right? That's a really different product than a set of rows and columns with a data dictionary and a code book and a survey where you know exactly what questions were asked, you know exactly what's in that data set, and somebody else can look at that and generate different analyses. Which might make us think that it is impossible and completely inappropriate to require us to share our data. And I think I'm spending a lot of time here sort of poking holes in this kind of post-positivist orientation and these assumptions for data sharing that don't hold for our qualitative or social science work. But in that exercise with Dina, I also did a very good job of convincing myself that under some circumstances and for some reasons, this might be a very good idea. And maybe we should really explore how to do it. So I have examples of how we write multiple papers out of small qualitative data sets because they're so robust and so many things came up that were unexpected that we answered our primary research questions and we wrote our primary paper, and then somebody came in after and we wrote another beautiful paper out of that same data set that we didn't intend to, but somebody new saw something different. I also have examples of how we've combined qualitative data sets from two separate studies to answer a third question that only could have been answered through the combination of those two data sets and reanalysis of that data set with a new team and a new perspective. And that is exactly the rationale for these data sharing methods, right? That maybe we can learn something new and generate new inference if we combine things or look at them in a different way. So I think there are good reasons that we might want to share. And I think it is possible that we can generate new inference and better science if we think about ways that we can leverage the investment of the qualitative data we're doing, that we're collecting. But there are some ethical and practical issues around data sharing that we need to think about, and we need to think about in advance if we're going to even imagine doing this in the future. And did you email them that paper?
I put it in the Google Drive.
Okay.
Google Drive.
There's a paper in the Google Drive that also kind of outlines some of these things in a nice way. But I'm kind of grouping them into these issues of consent for sharing, privacy and confidentiality, and then this issue of metadata. So if we are going to think about sharing qualitative data, we have to think about that at the very beginning. And we are all subject to these NIH mandates now. And so you do actually have to write about this in your data sharing and management plan and plan for it in your consent form to figure out if and when and how you're going to share qualitative data. So these folks did a study of people enrolled in a genomics, a big genomics study where they asked them what they thought about being consulted. They did interviews with people to get their opinions about data sharing, and most of those people said that they wanted to be asked for permission for their data to be used in future studies. But they thought that kind of an opt-out to data sharing was not enough. So we have to, as we move forward under these new data sharing mandates, we have to think about what language is going to be in our consent forms and how we're going to inform people of the possibility that their data might be shared. And we're having these conversations as part of the big harm reduction research network. And we had conversations early on about what is the language that we're going to put in our consent forms. Here's some of the example language that they gave us. There are other examples out there. And this does not give people an option. But one thing that we can also think about is kind of giving people an option about whether they will allow their data to be shared. And then I'm thinking now about this issue of consent form comprehension and how are we really going to explain to people what it means for their stories to sit in an archive somewhere that could be accessed by other people, and how are we going to really explain to people the extent to which we're going to protect their privacy to do that. Like it introduces new issues in terms of how we're going to explain the risks involved in a study.
I do think at this point, they do have a choice because they can say no. They see this language.
Yeah.
Right. So at this point, what's interesting is it's the no, I'm not going to be in this because I just saw what you're going to do with the data. So, you know, the extent to which asking them if you can share the data. I mean, this has been always a problem for us in more quantitative, asking them, you're then reducing your population and whether or not, and then you're collecting data, but half of it's shared, half of it's not, right? But even though you're collecting, so it's a very interesting interplay between people just refusing to be in it because you are going to share versus inadequate sharing because half of your population said no, but you're still publishing an article based on this.
So you're potentially introducing selection bias into your
Both
sample.
ways, both ways.
And you are potentially, and this is what Natasha Mausner has been writing about, you are potentially changing the nature of the data that you're creating.
Right.
Not only are you selecting for people who might be more willing to have their data shared, but you're also potentially changing what they're going to share with you. So because these qualitative data are created through this relational process, right? The stories that people tell us, especially about the things that many of us are interested in, hidden and stigmatized and criminalized things, they will change the way they tell you stories if they know that you're going to share their data. And maybe those data become less of a confessional and more of a public facing sort of sterilized life history narrative. So, and this is where Dina and Natasha and these people are really trying to think about not just the privacy and confidentiality concerns, but what do these mandates mean for the nature of the data that we produce? Like, is the fact that we are going to share these data creating different data than we would have gotten otherwise? Yes.
So with de-identified, how much can you de-identify? Like, can you take out the interviewer? Oh,
But go ahead. Yes, this is where we're going next. What are you thinking?
with qualitative, a lot of times the interviewer may share personal information and they are not quite as anonymous sometimes. Can you remove all of that?
And if you do, does that render the data interpretable by somebody else? This is my other concern, right? There is the concern of how do we protect our participants, but then there is also this question of if you remove enough to de-identify a transcript and really truly anonymize something, is there even something there that's worth analyzing again? Say your interviewer is disclosing something, which maybe we don't want them to do, but maybe they do anyway, about their own personal experience to create that relationship with somebody else. And then you take that out and then you completely don't understand what the respondent was responding to because you've had to redact sections of the transcript to keep people safe. I have that problem all the time in my studies because it's such a small town that, you know, one person telling one very particular story, everybody knows who that person is. I know how to de-identify that transcript sufficiently to report those results because we talk about it, but you might not know that that one story is like a thing that everybody knows about this one guy, right? So if I give you the transcripts to analyze and I'm not part of that process, you don't know how to keep my respondents safe. And I was going to talk here about, and probably the anthropologists in the room know this story better than I do, but the Nancy Shepherd Hughes's first study in the 70s, she was doing ethnography in a small village in Ireland. And she was asking about issues of morality and schizophrenia and mental health. And she wrote this ethnography and the people in the village read the book and they all knew everything, right? They all knew all their own stories. And it caused a lot of problems. She was the lone ethnographer, right? She built those relationships. She knew those people. She did the best she could to protect them in writing the book. And she didn't even do it well enough. So if her transcripts and her interview notes and her field notes were made public, how could anybody else know how to keep those people safe if she couldn't even do it and she was embedded in that?
Carly, you've also touched on an issue of if you're going to share this data, have your interviewers been briefed that what they say is going to be public, because normally we don't de-identify for interviewers, right?
Yeah, it's a very good point.
Sometimes easy to figure out who they are because there might be authors on the paper or they're acknowledged or thanked.
Yeah.
And there, you know, I find often doing an intervention study that's done online, done on Zoom, and the interviewers were having to grapple with the fact that if the participant is not alone, and you can't tell in a Zoom, that what the interviewers are or the interventionists are self-disclosing is a little complicated. And I would think that would happen in spades in this situation.
Yeah. Yeah, and that makes me think about this sort of secondary, right? There are new secondary subjects in this research now, if they are part of the record.
But there might not be subjects, but because they're working in this, but they're vulnerable and they're in the same community often if it's, you know.
But, and so this is the like, so what if I am a methodologist and I am interested in the ways in which the questions that interviewers ask generate narrative. And so I go to one of these data sharing archives and I get everybody's transcripts from everybody's different studies and pool them together to try to answer a methodological question. Maybe that's the only way I could possibly answer that question, but then they become the subject of my research and they didn't consent to that. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about it like that.
Or will make it worse.
Yeah,
You know, it's interesting because when you started by saying, you know, they had you try to do the opposite, it was making me think about how to think about qualitative, like what is qualitative data? Because we're talking about a certain type of qualitative data that we're all familiar with, but
right.
like my first publication was coding letters between a mentor and mentee over a 9-year period and code it for adolescent. It was an adolescent and code it for Erikson stages of development. And that in that time we were following Gordon Alpert's methodology. And at the time, feminist researchers really wanted to use that methodology to go back and analyze documents and letters from women to really highlight women's experience that we were not writing about over all that time. And so it makes me think about when it is actually helpful to be able to, you know, these letters had been written decades before, to be able to go and see this data and recode it with a different intent in mind. So I'm trying to, you know, and thinking about this counter argument, like what are, you know, again, how do we get to a place where it's comfortable enough, but also we are able to protect folks. So anyway,
I mean, historians wouldn't have a job if they didn't have archives of written texts to analyze. And anthropologists have been archiving qualitative data for years. There are social science archives where ethnographic work has been archived for always, right? Like Smithsonian keeps it.
Sure.
So it's not like this is new. There is a tradition of it. But somehow it feels, I don't know, to me, it feels new in this context. Because why?
Because it's being mandated.
Right, because it's mandated.
Is there a discrepancy between the policy and the actual implementation of the policy? I submitted something for NSF in which I did sort of this, in which I was like, I'm going to de-identify people, and I'm also going to have to de-identify a lot because it's going to be really obvious. Even if I don't have a name, someone could still say, oh yeah, I know that person. And the reviewers were like, I don't know why you're sharing qualitative research at all. So they were even combating the sense, and I'm like, this is NSF, like you were the first ones to do this, and now
NSF's policy has been in place for much longer.
And they were like, you shouldn't be doing this at all. Like you should do the research, right? But you don't need to share your qualitative data.
What was the purpose behind the sharing?
Well, because it was required, but the study was looking at LGBTQ students going through STEM and looking at the minority stressors that they experience while in their undergraduate programs. So one could say, like my biology professor called me out in public, and one could argue that like someone would know who that is, whatever have you. But again, the reviewers were like, I don't share your qualitative data.
Well, to me, that is kind of the interesting bit about this is, why are we doing this? Right? Are we doing it because somehow we think that, are we doing it for the purposes of reproducibility and replication? Are you doing that to prove to them that you found the truth and you accurately assessed the thing that exists within that data set? Or are you doing it because other people want to leverage your data and use it in a different way, or want to ask different questions? I think and to me, where the argument around data sharing gets problematic is in this idea that the reason that we're sharing our qualitative data is somehow to increase the trustworthiness of what we've done, or the rigor, or the reproducibility, because it's inconsistent with the paradigm that created the data. So here's what the data sharing plan has to include: what type of data you're generating, what tools or software are needed to analyze the data or access it. Standards is kind of the metadata, like the data documentation. What is in this data set? How do I read it? What are the variable names? Which is all really intuitive with quantitative data, but again, not very intuitive with qualitative data. Where will they live and how long will they be there? This, I think, it speaks to the caveats that Brenda's talking about in terms of reuse considerations and how you will manage compliance. So these are there's actually a template that they've put together that you can just kind of plug and play and fill this stuff in. And I think part of the discussion here is these things are really obvious and we can be really clear about them when we're talking about our survey data sets, but it doesn't always transfer very intuitively to our qualitative data, and we need to think about it a little more as we're writing these plans. And often we write these things in the 11th hour, right? Because we spent a month writing the science, and then we're doing all of the other 100 pages of the proposal in the last 30 minutes before it's due. And so there's a risk that we do kind of a hand wavy job in writing these data management plans because we really haven't thought through the issues. And then because it's like the last form we fill out because we've been so concerned about the science. And there is now in the guidance, they are specifying allowable costs for doing this work. So you can also budget for it, the cleaning. So I just found the data sharing plan that I wrote for my new grant that was funded under the HEAL initiative and through the Harm Reduction Research Network. And I said, our approach to data sharing will be to make all quantitative de-identified data available online as per required through the HEAL platform. We will discuss sharing of qualitative data during the HEAL Harm Reduction Research Network quarterly meetings to identify best practices to make these data available without potentially exposing participants to unacceptable risks. With attention to how these risks may be greater in the context of qualitative data collection in a small town, where even small amounts of narrative and contextual data could reveal participants' identities. We are aware of initiatives such as the Qualitative Data Repository and are keen to engage in this process while also prioritizing the ethical and epistemological considerations unique to qualitative data collection and sharing. Well, it's also coming up, it's coming up in our pre-award group too, because you have to write out your plans for where you're going to archive the data and how you're going to share it. And are you going to use indirects, right? There's allowable and unallowable costs. So are these things that fall under the F&A that the university is getting to maintain that data archive? Or is it something that you're paying? And then what happens when your 5-year grant runs out? Who's paying for that data archive? Yeah. And oh, I did, as I was looking into this, find that Fordham has a qualitative data repository. And Syracuse does too. I think the one that people most talk about is the Syracuse one, the qualitative data repository. So, and I mean, we're talking about the tensions here, but like there is a long tradition of doing this. People do this. And I still think there are some good reasons to do it. But I think we've got to engage in this process of thinking through how and when and why we're going to do it so that we can write these things thoughtfully. This DSMP to me is no longer a boilerplate thing that you kind of drop into the grant that you got from somebody else that you got from somebody else. Like, I think it does really require some thoughtful engagement with what are the data you're creating? How are they created? What can you do with them? What harms can they create in a different way than I had to 5 years ago?